Mic test. 1, 2. Standby crew. 3, 2, 1. Rolling for On Her Side.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, and welcome to On Her Side. I have today my guest with me, Nuzhat Khurshid. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Jazakallah for coming on today.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
No problem at all. So today we're talking about something that's actually really, really relevant these days. Very important topic, and that is of emotional intelligence. And why is it important, and how do we build it? So let's start by defining the term itself. It's the ability to understand our emotions, to control our emotions, and then understand that of others as well. So why is emotional intelligence so important?
I think emotional intelligence is very important because it's the foundation of how we act and how we relate to others, how we understand others and what their needs are. I think it's very important, and I think that nowadays there is more awareness of the importance of emotional intelligence.
Yeah, I think with the, globally, us becoming so connected through social media and through other means as well with technology and all, the number of interactions that we're having with one another have increased dramatically. So I think it becomes even more relevant and important for us to understand how to guide ourselves, how to behave, how to control our reactions and emotions with those interactions. And then it goes, obviously, as you said, towards building healthy relationships, right? So I was doing a lot of research before coming on here today about emotional intelligence, just to really, even teach myself and guide myself. And I came across basically that emotional intelligence is divided into some pieces, some key elements that form the concept of emotional intelligence. And they are self-awareness, okay, self-regulation, motivation, empathy, and then social skills, as we talked about, that being a critical foundation of relationships. So I think let's talk about self-awareness first. What does that mean? Basically, it is being aware of yourself, of owning your emotions, being aware of what you're feeling, right?
Yeah, I think self-awareness is key in emotional intelligence. It's the first step. If we're not aware of what we're feeling, then we can't really relate to how others are feeling as well. I think that sometimes in some cultures, there's not enough kind of awareness about this aspect. And as kids, sometimes we tell them to not express themselves, or we don't encourage them to label what it is that they're feeling.
Yeah.
So we definitely need to overcome this and talk about it more. I think that Islam also encourages us to be aware of what we're feeling. There's a hadith in Al-Bukhari about anger, that the strong person is not the one who can defeat someone in wrestling, but the strong person is the one who can control their anger.
Yes.
So I think that's very important. It shows us that anger can lead to other kinds of negative emotions and even some sins. So it's important to have control over how we manage that anger.
Yeah.
There's also there's a verse in the Holy Quran that God does not change a people unless they change themselves first. So I think that's very important as well, because oftentimes we think of prayer as like a magical spell that can help us in any situation, but we also need to work on ourselves and understand our own reactions before we can expect God to fix our relationships and our issues for us, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I'm just thinking about from an early age, kids these days are actually taught how to become very self-aware about the emotions that they're feeling. And actually, an example, when my daughter was in junior kindergarten, her teacher actually had a board made up in class where she had divided up the board into like different colors, right? And every color stood for an emotion. So a red color was anger, yellow was feeling sick maybe, and blue was angry or whatever. So there were different colors, and they were associated with different emotions. And what the child was asked to do was that throughout the day, as their emotions and their feelings would change, they would take their name cards and they would go and stick it onto that color column where it associated with the feeling that they were having. And so my daughter would come home and she said, today my name was in the blue column all day long. I didn't change it even for a minute, because this is how I felt the whole day. So even at that age of 4, they were learning about different emotions and how to identify when you're feeling a certain way. And it's like you said, from a young age, perhaps kids are taught how to be aware, how to regulate their emotions, etc. But oftentimes, as grown-ups, we make this mistake, even as parents, we make this mistake of trying to shut down negative emotions. We say to the child, don't be upset, don't be angry.
Right.
And what that does is that it doesn't enable them to work through or learn how to work through that particular emotion, right? And shutting down is not the answer. It's not going to make them not feel that way.
Right,
They're going to
right.
continue, but they're just going to repress it. They're going to internalize it.
Yeah,
Right.
I think that's very important. I think it's key, actually. So if we are teaching children to shut down in the face of difficult emotions, and that's a skill that they're going to carry with them through adulthood and the rest of their lives,
Yeah.
and definitely it's going to impact their other relationships. So I agree with you that naming these emotions is very important.
Yeah.
And I like the example that you gave of your daughter in school. I know I got my kids' report cards a few days ago as well, and there's actually a separate column.
A section in there, yes.
Yeah, about self-regulation, and I think it has to do with how well kids can set goals for themselves and then follow through on those goals, as well as if they can step back and identify some of their own strengths and weaknesses in class.
Yeah.
So this is an important component of the elementary level report card as well.
Yeah.
I think not just for students, but as you mentioned, for adults as well, it's very important to be able to step back from any kind of difficult, challenging situation
Yeah.
and recalibrate and think.
Yeah.
I think sometimes we may be triggered by certain things, or we may have a tendency to react in certain ways based on the way that we've grown up and we've seen people reacting to those difficult challenges. But I think that as adults as well, it's important to be able to recalibrate and think before we respond to others as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's all a part of self-regulation, whether
Yeah,
you're a
yeah.
student or an adult.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think when you say respond to others, so that's the piece in the definition where it's the ability to understand your own emotions and that of others.
Right.
So that's the social awareness part, and I think a key skill there is empathy, because that's you putting yourself in other people's shoes and trying to understand things from their perspective, right?
Yeah.
And that really is what causes that empathy to support your understanding. I think the other thing too is that not only does empathy enable you to get insight into other people's perspectives, but there's lots of opportunities now with the advent of social media and technology where you're able to gain insight into other people's struggles and how they're whatever that they're being challenged with in this world. Some of their struggles might not be the same as yours, might be completely separate worlds that it feels like you're living in. But with that empathy, you're able to understand a little bit more about where they're coming from, and what their struggles are truly like, and why they're acting the way they're acting, perhaps, or speaking the way they're speaking, behaving the way they're behaving, right?
Yeah, definitely. I agree. I think that there's definitely advantages to social media and our era of technology, because we are able to know what's going on all over the world and to, like you said, have empathy. But I think there's also the downside to that as well, where technology can sometimes impact the development of emotional intelligence in children if it is not used within limits.
Yes.
And if parents don't have, boundaries to the use of technology.
Yeah, actually, when I was doing my research, I learned about that as well. And they were saying about how technology or the overuse of technology for anybody, not just for children specifically, but it actually decreases your tolerance and it increases impulsivity. In people, and what it does is that it forces you to react to what you're seeing, and most of the time, the content that you're consuming is coming at you at such an amazing speed and
Right.
rate, that you're not able to reflect at all to what you're seeing.
Right.
You're just simply reacting. Oh, do I like this? Do I not like this? If I like it, I'll just keep going.
Right,
And more
right.
and more content will be coming your way, and your brain is forced to keep absorbing it.
Right.
And so, really, that takes away, I think, from emotional intelligence. And that's been proven through so much research.
Yeah, and not only is it the quantity of information is so much more than when in previous generations, but the quality of the information can be hard to sift through to know what is accurate, what is not accurate, what you should be acting on, what you shouldn't be acting on.
Yeah.
I think the pandemic as well, where has taught us a lot of lessons. So a lot of people had to use technology. People were working from home. Students were studying from home as well. I know there have been some studies that show that because of the use of technology in excessive amounts over the pandemic, it has had long-term impacts on the health of children nowadays as well.
For sure.
So that's something that we do need to mitigate and to work on.
Yeah, absolutely. We were talking about empathy and developing empathy for those who are around us and trying to gain insight into their perspectives. And there's so much to be learned once you do go down that road. For example, I remember there was a friend of mine like many years ago, and she was always complaining about her husband not spending enough. Like he was a big saver, never ready to spend on anything. He would just rather not spend on anything. And I'm very serious. So she was always complaining about that. Like we never do this, we never do that, we don't buy anything extra, we never go out to eat, and all of that. And I said to her, what you need to do is you need to kind of figure out where that's coming from, where that tendency to save and oversave and be so conservative, where does that come from? And, try to find out what you can and have some conversations and discussion or whatever. And I think she did. And over time, one day she was telling me about how she learned that when growing up, unfortunately came from a single parent household, and they were not well off financially by any means, and they were not very economically stable or secure. So growing up, all he saw his mother do was to save, and what he was taught over and over again through all of his life, as his childhood especially, was that you need to save, because you don't know what's going to come next. You need to save. And that was so ingrained in him that as an adult who was earning enough, who had a family, who had a good, lifestyle, he couldn't let go of that. So the root cause, right? So you need to think about, why do people act the way they act?
Yeah. I think it's very important for emotional intelligence to look at some of these subconscious ways of reacting to the world that we've learned in childhood. And oftentimes we really have to put in the work to unpack some of that and to even understand why it is that we're acting this way that may seem irrational to those around us. And when we do put in the work to look into our childhood, perhaps.
Our behaviors, our habits.
Right. And then it makes a lot more sense. And then once we recognize that, we are able to move forward and maybe even change some of those habits.
Exactly. Or at least learn to address them. How are we going to get out of this? Or how are we going to control this particular tendency that we have? And even if you yourself are not at that point, maybe you're not at that emotionally intelligent level where you're able to unpack that or to look inward and to, come up, perhaps identify some of these weaknesses or whatever it is. I think once again, if the other individual or the person near you or your support system, your family members, if they take on that, that empathy lens and start to engage you in conversations and discussions as to why this behavior is happening.
Right,
That
right.
will also help you not only learn about yourself, but also give them some insight so that they can avoid negative reactions to these tendencies, right?
Yeah.
Another example that I have, there was this friend of mine who used to tell me that my mother-in-law, wherever we go, she talks about herself all the time and she praises herself, right? So she's always talking about how all the perfect things that she does and has and her lifestyle and how her kids have been raised like the perfect way. And she was just commenting on how irritating it is because wherever I go, she's just always praising herself. And once again, when I heard that, I happened to know that lady. I happened to know the mother-in-law, and I thought to myself later on, like, this person this woman had actually lost both of her parents from a very young age. And it was her older brother who had actually ended up raising and financially sort of supporting all of the siblings after the death of their parents. And so for her, I think it was more about she felt like she had to stand up for herself. She
Right.
needed to make sure that people knew what her worth was
Right.
because she never had that support system,
Right.
from her parents or a close-knit family where children feel secure when they know their parents value them, right?
Right.
But without
Right.
that structure, with that missing, she
Right.
kind of grew up by herself, right?
Yeah.
And so wherever she goes now, she feels this compensating tendency to ensure that people know that she's living well and she's
Right.
done well,
Right,
So it all
right.
comes from a different place. There's always a root cause for why people behave the way they behave, and all you've got to do is take that time.
For sure,
Right?
yeah. And if we don't take that time to try to put ourselves in other people's shoes and to understand why it is that they're acting the way they do, then
Yeah.
it can be easy to be judgmental or
Yeah.
to be annoyed or angry.
Yeah.
But also, I think that, I agree that it's very important to have those conversations with people in our family and to be able to be reflective. But I think that sometimes it can be hard to hear those things and criticisms from someone so close to you.
Yeah.
So in those cases, I think it can be very beneficial to speak to a professional, a therapist. And I think that it should be encouraged. Sometimes going to a therapist can seem, there can be some stigma around that.
Yeah.
And it can seem like, there must be something wrong with you,
Yeah.
or maybe you're being ungrateful, or maybe
Yeah.
you're not being religious enough. But I
Yes.
think that part of emotional intelligence is recognizing when you do need help.
Support, yes.
And it's 100% fine to acknowledge
Yes.
that you need support.
Yeah.
Just as if there's a physical issue with our body,
We would
wouldn't
definitely
try,
go, yeah.
We wouldn't try to address like a broken leg on our own,
On
right?
our
So
own.
why would we try
Yes.
to address
Yes.
a mental health issue on our
Yes.
own? So there's no shame in that either.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, just to conclude on the empathy point too, is that once you do have that insight into other people's lives and their reactions and actions, you're more willing to compromise and sacrifice to make that relationship healthy, right?
Yeah.
You're more willing to support them, and that leads to, of course, that's what building a healthy relationship is about, as opposed to having constant conflict in that relationship
Yeah.
because you're not able to see that other person's point of view.
Right.
And also, I think that gives you wisdom.
Yes.
It helps you evolve and it helps you become more intelligent over time.
Yes, definitely. I like the word you used, wisdom, because to me it reminds me of balance. So I think that emotional intelligence goes both ways.
Yes.
It's not all about, as mothers, I think sometimes we think it's all about sacrificing ourselves and understanding others and putting our
Yes.
own needs on hold. But I
Yes.
think it's also important to look at our own needs. And if we're not able to have empathy for ourselves, then how can we have empathy for others?
Yes. Learning to forgive ourselves,
Yeah.
working through our own feelings about our inadequacies, perhaps, or weaknesses, or things like that. And also, I mean, having an emotionally stable a woman as your mother is going to have amazing positive impacts on the
Right.
mental health of your children. And you're going
Definitely.
to end up raising emotionally intelligent children because you yourself are well placed, you know? You have that stability and security, and you have evolved emotionally, and you have that self-awareness, etc.
I agree 100%. I think if children see that their mother is also taking care of herself, yes, she's taking care of the children, she's taking care of the household, but she's also taking care of herself, then I think that's the best role model for them. And they know then that it's also important for them to listen to their own needs and be aware of their own emotions as well.
Yeah, yeah. Now, we talk about building and maintaining healthy relationships, and a key aspect of that, of course, is intelligent communication, right? So we communicate on a daily basis with various people at various levels, etc. Why is intelligent communication so important?
I think communication is especially important now in the age of technology, where oftentimes we don't communicate at all face to face, right?
Yeah.
So many of our interactions are through text and or through emojis or
Behind a
something
screen.
behind the
Yeah,
screen.
yeah.
So yeah, the communication is even more important now, and I think that we have forgotten how important it is to have those meaningful face-to-face conversations with people. Yeah,
And
I
we don't
think
value it enough.
we don't, and we don't have time for it much anymore, right? So
yeah.
I think time can be the main obstacle as well, especially for busy mothers, to make that time to listen to our children, and not just while we're doing the housework, but to actually sit down, look them in the face, and try to read their emotions, their body language,
Yeah.
understand, and put everything else aside. So just for
Yes.
those, even if it's 10, 15 minutes, the children know that they are the most important thing and they have 100% of your attention.
Yeah.
I think that's
And to stay
important.
focused on that, and that really, you know, I mean, one of the things that I see happen all the time. So you know, a mother, she's busy, she's cooking, and at the same time she's asking her child, how did your day go at school today, or how
Right.
did your test go? And so
Right.
now she is listening, she's actively listening,
Right.
but she's actually not watching her child. She has her back
Right.
to the child. Now the child is telling her how her day went at school, but you're not able to read their body language because you're
Right.
not looking at them.
Yeah.
You're not able to pick up on the emotional cues that they're exerting through micro expressions, right? That can tell you so much more than the words that you're listening, right?
Definitely,
So to,
yeah.
to stay focused on those conversations that, like you said, make them meaningful, and get the most out of them, you know, to try to be
Right.
most productive from every interaction,
Yeah.
whether it's with your child, whether it's, you know, I read somewhere that they said that it's so surprising that some of the most critical conversations about finances between a married couple actually happens in the car when one person is driving. So imagine the level of concentration on focus that driving requires,
Right.
and then imagine making important financial life decisions while that's happening.
Right.
But
right.
people do it.
Right.
And like
right.
you said, because of time most of the time, right? Oh, well, we're
Right.
here right now. Let's use this time to talk about whatever it is.
Yeah.
And that's absolutely the wrong way to manage your decisions and to have really, really important conversations because, like you said, intelligent communication is about the nonverbal as well, right? The
Yeah.
body language as well, the emotional cues
I agree 100%.
and such.
Yeah.
You know, there's also various other emotions, I think, that we overlook when we talk about emotional intelligence, and we feel like those emotions are for granted. You know, you're only going to react a certain way. So if I take the example of grief, for example, you know, sometimes people will take loss or grief and mask it with anger or resentment. That's how they choose to express it, because they're not able to cope with it perhaps. And so they would rather place blame on why is it that they're hurting.
Right.
They'll place blame on so and so did this, which is why I lost this or that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think that's also a huge conversation about becoming emotionally intelligent in order to learn to work through and cope with difficult emotions instead of masking them
Yes.
with others, right?
Definitely. Yeah, I see that all the time. It's so much easier to blame someone else or to yell at someone than it is to actually look within and to try to understand and be self-critical, right?
Yeah.
Because then that would lead to vulnerability, right?
Yes.
Or shame or
Yes.
guilt or whatever
Yes.
negative
Yes.
feelings that we're trying
Yes.
to avoid.
Yes. And also, in times where perhaps you've made a mistake, but it's so difficult for you to own up to it, it might be easier to just be angry.
Yes.
Right? And mask it with yelling or whatever, or picking up on another mistake that someone else has made so that you can
Yes.
cover up yourself. So these are all things that go into, evolving into an emotionally intelligent person. Another thought that I had, another example, was about, people who communicate perhaps too directly. There's some overly honest people who they're very straightforward. And I think that in their minds, they might feel like they're very emotionally intelligent because they're able to say exactly what they mean and be very open about their feelings, etc. But I think there's also, of course, harm in that, because if it's not properly worded, if it's not properly expressed, that could really be extremely arrogant and very insensitive as well. It comes across as that, right?
Right.
So there's so many layers, I think, that we need to work through
Yeah.
in terms of evolving into an emotionally intelligent person.
Yeah, I agree. I think the issue of language is also so important now, especially when we're talking about the relationship between parents and children. So oftentimes, children are growing up in a different environment or a different culture than their parents. So, for example, here in Canada, children are speaking English with each other. And parents may not understand all the nuances of what they're saying, the expressions and the words that they're using. Children may not even be able to communicate with maybe grandparents who are even more unfamiliar with the language. So I think that the language barrier can also be an issue when it comes to emotional intelligence, just because clear communication is so important. And if you're not understanding what it is that the
Yeah.
children are saying,
Yeah.
then that becomes very difficult as well.
And I think that kind of ties in with the whole technology piece that you were talking about before, is because oftentimes the additional layer of complexity happens when you're not even having those in-person conversations anymore. So
Right.
now you're having conversations through text. It's even more difficult to portray or to express. How are you going to read somebody's body language, the tone that they were saying that word in, the way that you're reading it. So
Right.
that becomes a source of a lot of misunderstandings and miscommunication and conflict as well.
Definitely. A lot of psychologists, when talking about self-regulation, talk about meditation. So I just remembered that, that Islam actually gives us so many beautiful words of wisdom about that with regards to Quran and namaz, right? So 5 times a day we have to step aside from whatever difficult situation we may be in, and we pray to God. And in that, in the process of ablution and prostration, we do calm down, right?
Yeah.
So that's like a mandatory meditation that we do have in our religion, which can also help with some of these difficult, challenging situations that we have.
You were mentioning therapy and how it is a little bit stigmatizing, and it's not sometimes in some cultures even acceptable or appropriate, for some people to seek support through counseling. The other thing that I think is also stigmatizing sometimes is in some cultures, men or boys are not allowed to express, as openly or as honestly especially some of the more sensitive emotions, as girls are maybe. And that also goes a long way towards towards emotional intelligence in those boys or in men. And I think that's something that we definitely need to address because obviously, we're both productive members of society, and to imagine having a father or an elder in your house who themselves is not emotionally evolved, and how that the impact of that would trickle down towards all members of the family in terms of impacting their social health and mental health, emotional health, spiritual health. So it has these huge impacts.
Yes, yeah. I think this relates back to when we were talking about the way that we've been raised. So oftentimes, what we see when we're children is what we emulate as adults ourselves, as a default setting, right? We don't really question why we're acting that way, but it just comes naturally to us because that's the way that we grew up, right?
Yeah.
And for boys, sometimes, the way that they saw their parents interacting that the men were not very open with their emotions, or the men weren't involved in household matters or talking to their children. And so we do see that men are trained maybe even subconsciously to act that way with their own children.
Yeah, that they're supposed to internalize those sensitive emotions. And I'll give you an example. So sometimes I'm all about expression and communication and all of that at home, right? So if my husband is getting angry sometimes or he's getting frustrated or whatever, I'll always say to him, okay, so let's talk, tell me what's really bothering you and all of that. And he's always just like, I'm not a woman. Okay, so don't talk to me like I'm a woman. And I was just like, what does that mean? It's just the two of us. Why can't we talk? It's like no one's judging you here, but that's his go-to answer. He's just like, stop asking me those questions. I'm not a woman.
Right.
And so it's that mindset, that actually people grow up with their whole lives, where talking and discussing emotions and things that are bothering you are all about women. Women do that, and men are not supposed to do that. But that's really, really unfair, I think, and also very impractical, in this day and age, because men, of course, have emotions and feelings as well, and they need to learn how to cope and how to manage them, right?
Yeah, I think this is an example of where culture can be mixed with religion sometimes, and emotionally intelligent people are well-rounded. People feel comfortable with them. People want to be their friend. They're just, they respect you, they respect your time, they value your feelings, they make you feel heard and accepted. And I think that
they're trustworthy.
They're trustworthy.
They communicate clearly.
Exactly. So it goes a long way, I think, in relationships.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Because when you have that kind of a person as your friend, it's going to want to make you share more easily. When you feel heard and respected, it makes you return that. And then that kind of impacts you, and then the trickle down effect of everyone in your circle, perhaps, and then the wider society having that more emotionally intelligent approach to conversations and interactions and relationships. And I think the key too is that emotional intelligence is it's a work in progress. You evolve, you mature with time, with age, with experiences, with the wisdom that comes to you. And so nobody is, the best that they can be at any given time. It's just everybody is constantly evolving down that road.
Definitely. I think it's a skill that we need to work on and practice, and the more we practice it, the better we'll get. And definitely, I think with age, with wisdom, different life experiences, we are challenged in our emotional intelligence, and we grow as people. And definitely, it's a work in progress.
Jazakallah for the conversation.
Jazakallah.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.
Cut. That's a wrap for On Her Side.